Thank you. Let me begin with a few words about the choice of topics. Actually, that list over there is quite a good choice, and I'll pick a few of them. It's no great insight that we live in a world of conflict and confrontation, and that one crucial element of it is class war. Class war has lots of dimensions and complexities, but in recent years the lines have been drawn very sharply. To oversimplify, but really not too much, on the one side there are concentrated power centers, state and private, very closely linked. On the other side is much of the population worldwide, and though one can't estimate with any precision, I think it's fair to guess a large majority of the world population that's in any way involved in, able to become involved in issues of broad significance, which requires a degree of privilege, of course. Concentrated power, they pursue their war relentlessly. They never stop. They use every opportunity to press their agenda forward in the harshest possible way. In particular, they use crises. So an earthquake or a war or September 11th and its aftermath. And in such circumstances, you can expect and you discover that they will exploit the atmosphere of fear and anguish and concern, and they hope that their popular adversary will be distracted, focus attention elsewhere, be frightened, while they continue to pursue their programs without any pause, in fact, increasing them, using the window of opportunity. And that's what's happening right now. The adversary should, of course, refuse to accept this cynical framework. It should focus its efforts also relentlessly on the primary issues, which remain as they were before the latest crisis. The issues include the threat of militarism, which is indeed a threat to the survival of the species at this point, and a very far-reaching assault against democracy and freedom, which is part of the core of the neoliberal programs of the past 20, 25 years. Well, those are the things I'd like to talk about. Everything, of course, is open for later discussions. I don't feel constrained by that. Though that is what I want to talk about, I can't really bring myself to turn to those topics without at least a word on the immense human tragedy that is unfolding before us right now, and that is being planned and implemented very consciously by the United States and its allies since September 11th. The High Commissioner of Human Rights of the United Nations, Mary Robinson, she was not exaggerating when she pleaded with the United States to stop the bombing and warned that if it continued, there would be a Rwanda-style slaughter. In fact, she may have been underestimating. According to U.S. estimates, the number of people at risk of starvation, which was about 5 million, has increased by 50% since the bombing started. That's 2.5 million people who are being pressed right across the border of death from starvation. Mary Robinson's appeal was, of course, rebuffed. It was also unreported. Literally, it received 3 scattered sentences in the entire U.S. press. Other appeals from high UN officials, aid agencies, and others were similar ones, were not even mentioned. On September 16th, it's just 5 days after the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, on September 16th, the U.S. demanded of Pakistan that it terminate food supplies to Afghanistan. The country has been on a kind of a lifeline, as one aid worker said afterwards, we've just cut the lifeline. The decision on September 16th to cut food supplies was a decision, a conscious, determined decision to starve several million people to death. There was no reaction to that. The next day, it just happened, I was on radio and television around Europe, mostly Europe, national radio and television. No one was aware of it or could think of a single reaction in their own country. There was no reaction in the United States. So apparently it's considered entirely normal for Western civilization to make a decision to kill 2.5 million people in the next few months. And that shouldn't surprise anyone who's familiar with history. It is, in fact, normal, which is why there is no reaction to the silent genocide that's underway. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, already before the bombing, they had warned that if the threat of bombing itself had driven out the aid agencies and driven people out of the cities into the countryside in fear and desperation, and they warned that a humanitarian catastrophe was taking place. After the bombing began, they reported further that about 80% of the crops plantings had been disrupted, which means that what is being planned is an even more severe famine for next spring. The bombing itself has turned major cities into ghost towns. About 70% of the population has fled. The bombing, as in other cases, Iraq, Serbia, the bombing is directed against power stations, electrical supplies, water supplies, sewage, and so on. That's a form of biological warfare. That's exactly what it means to do that in an urban area. The population is fleeing. Either they flee to borders which are mostly closed, or most of them flee into the countryside. In the countryside, they're heading into areas which are the most heavily mined in the world. 10 to 20 people, there are 10 to 20 deaths or injuries every day, even in normal times, many of them children. That increases sharply now, for one reason because the United Nations has been compelled to terminate its mine clearing operations. For another reason, because the mines are now superseded by much more lethal weapons, namely the cluster bombs from the U.S. bombing. These are anti-personnel weapons which they're designed to murder people. They don't affect tanks or buildings or anything like that. Little things that somebody will pick up, a child will pick up, or a farmer will hit with a hoe, and then it explodes and sends flechettes that tear them to shreds. And they're extremely hard to dismantle in some areas where they've been used, like northern Laos, in what was then the heaviest bombing in history, an isolated peasant society. It's still littered with millions of cluster bombs, hundreds or thousands of people killed every year, no demining efforts. The manufacturer says that 20 to 30% of them don't explode, which can mean only one of two things. Either incredibly incompetent quality control, or else a purposeful concern to murder civilians. You can take your choice. Well, all of this is happening essentially without comment, because in a way it is kind of normal. That's what the West has been doing to the rest of the world for hundreds of years. But the millennium is beginning with two monstrous atrocities, the terrible terrorist crime of September 11th, and an even worse atrocity that's following it, namely a purposeful, conscious program of mass murder, which could have excruciating dimensions. And while this is regrettably normal business in Europe and its offshoots, it's kind of remarkable to see that a country like India, which has been subjected to this torture for hundreds of years, and you might think would have some appreciation for what it means, is nevertheless enthusiastically joining the bandwagon. But that's your problem. These accumulating horrors bear very directly on the question of the people's right to information. It's extremely important to ensure that that right is denied. So what I've just said, although it's not really controversial, is almost totally unknown in the United States. There wouldn't be a person in a million who would be aware of this. And there's a good reason for that. If people did have the slightest idea of what's being done in their names, there's no doubt that there would be mass protests and that policies would have to change. The United States is a very free country. It's uniquely free, I think, the most free country in the world with regard to right to information. And the task of suppression of that right is not undertaken by the state. They may try now and then, but they're pretty ineffectual. The task of depriving the population of the right of information, that is the solemn duty of the intellectuals, of the educated classes, which you're trained for when you go to a good university, and of the free press. It's their task to ensure that the right to information is denied. That's why things like this remain unknown. You can't carry out mass genocide if the population is aware of what is being done. And when these controls break down, you do get strong popular reactions. Well, we're now living through, this is not the first case by any means, we're now living through an illustration which is so shocking that words fail, at least my words. It's not novel, we should be aware of that. It's not restricted to the United States and Europe. It goes back through history, as does the role of the priesthood, either religious or in modern days secular priesthood. Well, with these hopelessly inadequate words on a crime that we should be working day and night to try to bring to a quick end, let's turn to the topics at hand. Perhaps the best way to approach them is within the framework of this fashionable notion of globalization. But before doing that, it's important to clarify what it means. And like most terms of political discourse, it has a literal meaning and a kind of a technical propagandistic meaning. In the literal sense, globalization just means international integration, here mostly economic integration. And that's neither good nor bad. You know, it's just as trade is neither good nor bad. It depends what its human consequences are. It can be carried out in many different ways. That's the general meaning. The specific meaning that's in fact used and enforced by concentrated power, the term globalization refers to a very specific form of international integration, one which has been implemented with considerable intensity in the past 25 years approximately, and which is designed in the interests of private concentrations of power. The interests of others are incidental. They may gain, they may lose, it doesn't really matter. Fact of the matter is most of them lose, but that's just kind of a consequence. Oh, sorry. I'm told that people in the back can't hear. Is that true? Can you hear me back there? Yeah? I don't know what to do about it much, but I can't yell any louder. That's the technical sense of globalization. And with that ridiculous terminology in place, the great mass of the people of the world who object can be labeled anti-globalization. So they must be primitivists who want to go back to the Stone Age and are resisting inevitable forces. They want to harm the poor and all other terms of abuse that I'm sure you're familiar with. Opponents of globalization, I think, make a very great mistake if they accept this framework of power and agree to call themselves anti-globalization. No one sensible is opposed to international integration, least of all the left. The left has been animated by a vision of globalization since its origins. The whole vision of the left has been internationalism, international solidarity and cooperation. globalization. That's certainly since its modern origins. And there have been very important strides in this direction, many achievements in recent years. And we should be committed to that. We should be committed to far-reaching globalization, but designed to improve the lives and opportunities of people, the people of the world and the people of future generations. That's a task that cannot be put off. These aren't empty words. The possibilities for moving forward are very real. They are illustrated in many ways. The by now annual meetings at Porto Alegre in Brazil are an important expression of this. They bring together a very broad, They bring together a very broad international constituency, Brazilian workers, the landless workers movement, North American unionists, environmentalists, peasant movements, women's rights activists, very wide range of people who in the past have had nothing much to do with one another. They went in separate paths. But now, thanks to a constructive form of globalization that we ought to try to advance, and in fact it is the traditional vision of the left, are moving forward in ways that are impressive, that in part they're defensive, defending themselves against attack, but in part quite constructive, working on ways to dismantle concentrated power systems, to extend popular control worldwide. Well, that's the form of globalization that should be pursued, at least by people who want to create a world in which a decent person would want to live. The specific form of globalization that's being officially pursued is quite different. That's called, as you know, neoliberal. That's also highly misleading. It's not new, and it's by no means liberal. That should be obvious in India, if it isn't more than any other place. This is the whole history of India for the last several hundred years. Classic example of how liberalism can be distorted into an instrument of power and destruction. And the current version of neoliberalism is similar to what destroyed India, with a combination of imposed liberalization on India and massive state power and protectionism in the imperial power. And the current version adopts that traditional double-edged doctrine of liberalism and free trade. The doctrine is, it's fine for you so that I can demolish you, but I'm going to insist on the protection of the nanny state and other devices to make sure that I'm protected from the costs of market discipline, except with one exception, when the, to use the usual term, when the playing field is level, which means when it's tilted so sharply in my direction and in my favor that I'm confident that I can win. In that case, I'll favor free trade. The fact that the new versions adapt the traditional ones to current circumstances, that shouldn't be very surprising. Actually, it's exactly what you expect. If you look at the designers are the few richest and most powerful states, the international financial institutions that follow their directives, and an array of huge corporations, mega corporations, which are tending towards oligopoly, anti-market principles in most sectors of the economy, and are heavily reliant on the state sector, which is very dynamic in the rich and powerful countries like the United States, reliant on the state sector to socialize cost, socialize risk, privatize profit, and to maintain the dynamism of the economy. That's the real world economy. It's quite different from what you study in an economics class. The designers of the system modestly call themselves the international community. But maybe a more appropriate term is one that's used in the business press, world's major business journal, the London Financial Times. described them as the masters of the universe. That was last January when they were meeting in Davos, Switzerland, to organize the world. Maybe that was intended as ironic, I don't know, but it's accurate. The masters of the universe profess to be admirers of Adam Smith, so you might expect them to abide by his description of their behavior, although he only called them masters of mankind. But that was before the space age, remember. Smith was referring to those who he called the principal architects of policy in England, merchants and manufacturers, who, as he put it, attended to their own interests carefully and made sure that they were satisfied, no matter how grievous the effect on others, including the people of England. But incidentally, primarily India. He wrote with particular anger about the savagery of the English in India, in Bengal particularly. He stated that the principal architects, who are ensuring that their own interests are attended to very well, they follow what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, namely all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. That's an accurate description of the masters of the universe, who follow their model, not noticing that he was denouncing them, not providing a model for them. In subsequent developments over time that would have appalled Adam Smith or any other classical liberal, there has been these huge concentrations of power, which are basically tyrannies, have been assigned by the courts the rights of persons, immortal persons. The courts have proceeded to attribute the rights of persons to corporate management. That's true in the United States and I think elsewhere. In recent agreements, mislabeled trade agreements, in these recent agreements, the rights of these private tyrannies have gone way beyond the rights of persons. So, for example, General Motors can demand, under World Trade Organization rules, demand and receive what's called national treatment in Mexico. They have to be treated as a national company. On the other hand, if a Mexican of flesh and blood tried to obtain national treatment in New York, he wouldn't last very long, if he could even make it that far. So the corporate entities, the immortal persons, have rights by now far beyond human beings. They're a strange kind of person, apart from their massive scale and immortality. The recent agreements give them even further rights. So by now it's possible, and these rights are being explored and implemented, for corporate entities to undermine regulatory legislation in states, United States, Canada, others, on the grounds that these regulations are what is called tantamount to expropriation. That is, if the country regulates to take a recent case that was one, a U.S. corporation wanted to deliver toxic wastes to Mexico, to store somewhere in Mexico. The people of the state in Mexico objected. They didn't want toxic waste stored there, and they turned the area into a national park. The corporation, Metalclad, charged Mexico with actions that are tantamount to expropriation because that infringes on future profits of the corporation. And they won. They won in a NAFTA hearing, finally a judicial hearing, and the judicial hearing was correct because the NAFTA rules do permit that. This is under an imaginative doctrine called regulatory takings. Any regulation is a taking of people's rights, meaning corporate rights, because it might reduce their future profits. Well, those are rights that no person of flesh and blood can think of, but they're granted to these totalitarian institutions that dominate the international system, the masters of the universe. This is simply one part of what in fact is a very dedicated assault against popular sovereignty, which means democracy, which is expected to become more severe. In the Western Hemisphere, there are now plans, I'll come back to this, for a free trade area of the Americas. There was a summit of the countries of the Western Hemisphere last April in Quebec, plenty of disruption and violence in protest. It was kept secret. The plans are being kept secret. Nobody knows in any detail what the plans are for the free trade area of the Americas, and it's important to ensure that it remains secret, because if it becomes public, opposition will be overwhelming. I'll come back to that interesting exercise in thought control in a free society. The crucial point is that the public has to be kept unaware. That's been true all along. NAFTA is now North American Free Trade Agreement, 7 years old. To this day, the press has refused to publish the official position of the labor movement on the form that NAFTA should take. That's now 1992, almost 10 years. They've also refused to publish the analysis of NAFTA that was given by Congress's own research bureau, the Office of Technology Assessment, which is very much like that of the labor movement. The reason is that it was critical of the form of international integration that was being imposed by the masters of the universe, and therefore the public better not know about it, because if the public does know about it, the already majority opposition to NAFTA would grow substantially as people came to understand that their own individual criticisms were in fact well grounded in substantial institutions. And a very important central part of the neoliberal reforms is to reduce the threat of democracy in this and in other ways. Well, that's very much a lie. I mentioned that the one participant in the class war always exploits every opportunity to institute harsh and aggressive measures with unrelenting intensity. That's happening right now. They're telling their victims that they have to be subdued and acquiescent out of patriotism. On the other hand, patriotism does not prevent the masters of the universe from using the opportunity to, say, give new tax breaks to Enron, to mention a company you've heard of around here, to increase the military budget substantially while nobody's looking, even to institute what's called fast-track legislation. It's interesting. The U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Zoellick, immediately after the September 11th bombings, announced that the best way to combat terrorism is to implement fast-track legislation. What is fast-track legislation? Well, it's legislation that turns the United States into the Kremlin under Stalin. It's literally. The legislation grants the executive branch the right to negotiate international treaties in secret with no congressional participation and, of course, no public knowledge. And then Congress is allowed to say yes. That's the degree of public participation. So that's fast-track legislation. It's often called free trade legislation, and that's not entirely untrue. You couldn't pass legislation that's mislabeled free trade if the public had any participation. So it has to be done Kremlin style. But out of patriotism, undoubtedly Osama bin Laden will just be shaking in his boots if this legislation is passed. It's such an obvious attack against international terrorism. Well, that's the kind of thing that it makes sense to press through when you have a window of opportunity and the general public can be, if they can be induced to keep quiet out of so-called patriotism or fear or whatever. All of this does raise a question. It's been very obvious over the past years that opposition to corporate-led globalization is overwhelming across the world. That's been particularly dramatic in the South, where the main opposition developed. it later spread to the north, where it becomes harder to ignore. So, when it reaches Seattle, you can't pretend it's not happening. And it does raise the question why there is such massive public opposition in the United States, in England, and everywhere else. It seems paradoxical because globalization, so-called, is, we're told every day, has led to enormous prosperity. In the United States particularly, it's led to what's called a fairy tale economy. Just to give one quote from the extreme left of the admissible spectrum, Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, writing last March, said that it has created the greatest boom in American history, economic boom in American history, in fact the greatest economic boom in world history. So why are people opposed? Well, it's admitted that it has some flaws. Not everyone is participating in the glorious experience, and since we're good-hearted people, especially the left, we have to be concerned about this, and we have to worry about these people who lack the skills to join us in participating in the greatest economic boom in world history. And that also poses a dilemma. Why is it that this enormous prosperity that's developing and leading to fairy tale economies is also leading to inequality? What do we do about that? Well, that picture is so conventional that it takes a bit of a wrench to recognize that it is entirely false in every respect except one. The one respect that is true is it's leading to great inequality. Everything else is totally false and uncontroversially false. The economic boom in the United States in the 90s was, per capita economic growth was about the same as Europe. It's much less than it was in the pre-globalization period, the period before the neoliberal reforms of the 1970s. It's vastly less than it was during World War II, which was the greatest economic boom in American history under a semi-command economy. So the question is, how can the conventional picture be so different from absolutely uncontroversial fact? Well, the answer is very simple, and you know it very well in India. A small sector of the society has, in fact, benefited enormously. And that sector happens to include the people who tell everybody else the wonderful news. And they're not being dishonest. You can't accuse them of dishonesty. They have every reason to believe what they're saying. They can read it every day in the journals for which they write. Furthermore, it's exactly what they see around them. You go to an elegant restaurant or the faculty club or the editorial office or wherever you hang out. That's what you see, people who are enjoying a fairy tale economy. So there's no reason to doubt it. It's only the world that's somehow different. Who knows about that? Let's take a quick look at the historical record on this. Economic integration, globalization in a neutral sense, that increased very rapidly in the half-century or so before World War I. It leveled, stagnated between the two wars. Then it began to pick up again after World War II. By now, it's reached a level which is more or less comparable to about a century ago in gross measures, but only gross measures. If you look at the fine structure, it's quite different in interesting respects. Prior to World War I, there was much more international integration at the level of people. That is, movement of people was much freer. And those of you who care about free trade may recall that free circulation of labor is the foundation of free trade, according to old-fashioned radicals like Adam Smith. So movement of people is cut back a lot by state regulation. On the other hand, the free flow of very short-term speculative capital, that's risen to astronomical levels, way beyond anything in the past. And that difference reflects the central features of contemporary globalization. It expresses the relative value of people and capital. Capital has priority, people are incidental. Notice that that's exactly the opposite of classical economics, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They insisted that people should be mobile and capital should be immobile. Everyone's heard of Adam Smith's invisible hand. and how wonderful it is, but not many people have apparently read the one passage in Wealth of Nations in which he mentions the phrase. It appears once, and it appears in the course of an argument against capital mobility. He argues that the invisible hand will prevent this disaster from happening, somehow suppressed. There's other interesting differences. I'll come back to some of them. There is also a more technical definition of globalization. Globalization is measured by convergence to a single market, to single price and wage around the world. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what's happened. It's gone exactly in the opposite direction, led to enormous inequality. So there's a theory on one side and there's a real world on the other side. And that's expected to continue. The U.S. intelligence services recently put out a document, a projection for the next 15 years. That means there'll be less globalization in the technical sense, but more globalization in the doctrinally approved sense, rich wealth for the rich. Financial volatility, of course, means slower growth. So the best possible scenario is even slower growth and much less globalization in the technical sense, meaning more globalization in the sense they like. Military planners adopt exactly the same assumptions. There's now a vast expansion of armaments going on, primarily in the United States. Since September 11th, it's been escalated using the window of opportunity. And there's a reason. If you look at the planning documents of past years, they make the same prediction. They predict that globalization is going to lead to an increasing divide between a small number of haves and a large number of have-nots. Notice, opposite to the economic theory, but consistent with reality. And that raises a problem. It's a problem that has the technical name enforcing stability. And stability means you do what I tell you or else. And it's hard to enforce stability when you have a growing mass of have-nots who are disruptive and unpleasant and do bad things. Accordingly, it's necessary to have a huge expansion of the military. The United States is already far in the lead in conventional forces and weapons of mass destruction. Actually, it outspends the next 15 countries. But that's not enough. It has to move to a new frontier, space. It hasn't been militarized yet. That requires a violation of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which has been observed, has prevented militarization of space. That the United Nations is aware of this. In fact, the world is aware. So there's been a reaffirmation of the Outer Space Treaty every year for the last couple of years. And it's passed almost unanimously with 2 abstentions, the United States and Israel, probably next year India. Who's equally enthusiastic about joining the race to destruction for reasons you can explain to me. The UN Conference on Disarmament has been stalled all year for the same reason. They're trying to put a restriction on militarization of space. The U.S. blocks it. All of this is unreported. None of this appears in the American press for the same reason. It's not wise to allow citizens to know of plans that put the survival of the species at risk, at serious risk. Escalating the arms race to space is in fact the core program, and has been for years, it's not just Bush, of militarization, expanding what's called an arms race to space, although race isn't a very good term for it since the United States is racing alone for the moment, though there are others eager to join, like India, for example. Won a lot of respect from hawks and jingoists in the United States for its enthusiasm about this, which is unique, in fact. The plans to cross the last frontier to militarization of space are disguised as missile defense, ballistic missile defense. Now, anybody should understand that when you hear the word defense, you think offense. Any offensive action is always called defense. And it's pretty straight in this case. The goal of ballistic missile defense is to place offensive weapons, destructive offensive weapons in space. And the goal is very frankly expressed. it takes real discipline for the educated classes to keep people from knowing this. It's all in public documents. You can read them on the internet, very frank and clear for years. The goal is, the U.S. Space Command documents explain that the goal is to obtain global dominance, hegemony, they call it. And the purpose is to protect, I'm quoting all these quotes, to protect U.S. interests and investments. And they give a history. They say that in the past, countries constructed armies and navies to protect and enhance commercial interests. But now there's a new frontier we can cross. We can have new initiatives that'll take the next step in protecting and enhancing commercial and investment interests, namely militarization of space. Now, this is known to be extremely threatening. There's no question about this, because of the predicted reaction among potential adversaries, or for that matter, because of what are called normal accidents in the technical literature. A normal accident is the kind of accident you know is going to take place in any complicated system. You just can't tell when. That's called a normal accident. And what's being planned are systems of great complexity, weapons of very high destructive power, much more than nuclear weapons, laser weapons which are extremely destructive, powered by nuclear power, which itself is extremely dangerous in space, and on a hair-trigger alert. With automated strike-on-warning systems, because you can't take any chances. If anybody starts shooting down your satellites, your system is gone. So you have automated systems of massive destructive power, which are sure to undergo normal accidents, and therefore wipe everyone out. But could be stopped. Nobody doubts that it could be stopped, namely by treaty. But it's just, to stop it would be inconsistent with the prevailing value system. The prevailing value system is that hegemony is much more important than survival, and that's not new. In fact, it's the history of hundreds of years. The change now is that the stakes are far, far greater. Come back to globalization. The crucial point here is that this is motivated by the expectations for globalization. It's expected to lead to a widening divide, meaning failure in the technical sense, but success in the doctrinal sense, and that requires space-based weapons of mass destruction, targeting the growing numbers of have-nots that globalization is expected to produce, and severely raising the threat to survival. And it's all very rational. Within the framework of a kind of a lunatic set of institutions, it's totally rational. Well, let's return to the greatest economic boom in American and world history. Remember that this was written before the crash, before the fiscal bubble crashed early this year. So at a time when it really looked fantastic. Since World War II, there have been two pretty sharply different phases in the world economy. There was a phase called the Bretton Woods period, from shortly after the Second World War into the early 1970s. And then there's the neoliberal phase that followed it, when the Bretton Woods regulations were broken down. Bretton Woods system in the first period was based on regulation of capital. So regulation of capital flow, states could regulate outflow of capital and inflow, and currencies were fixed pretty closely to one another. And that was terminated in the 70s. Well, these two periods, it's the second period that's called globalization, though in fact international integration proceeded more quickly during the first period. But remember, this is a technical sense of globalization, neoliberal globalization. These two phases are quite different. Economists commonly refer to the first phase, the Bretton Woods phase, as a golden age, and to the second phase, the neoliberal phase, as a leaden age. And in fact, if you look at standard macroeconomic statistics, that's exactly what you find. They all declined considerably during the globalization period. That's true of rate of growth, of growth of the economy, rate of growth of productivity, capital investment. In fact, even trade. Trade has declined during the globalization period. The interest rates have gone way up because countries have to, especially countries of the South, have to protect their currencies from attack. That slows down growth. Financial volatility is increased, and many other harmful consequences. Well, let's return to that profound dilemma that everyone's worried about. What are we going to do about the fact that we have this enormous prosperity resulting from globalization, but it's leading to inequality? Well, there's no dilemma. There's nothing to answer. There's no prosperity. In fact, globalization has reduced prosperity, even by standard macroeconomic measures, which are highly ideological, but even by those. And it's not controversial. Many economists attribute the decline in the economy, severe decline during the globalization period, to liberalization of capital. You can debate that. So little is understood about the international economy that causal relations are hard to establish. But the correlation is very clear, and down to fine detail, in fact. However, there's one thing that is clear, namely financial liberalization does lead to an attack on democracy. That's not controversial. In fact, that was the reason, the primary reason, why the framers of the Bretton Woods Agreement back in the 1940s insisted on capital controls and regulation of currencies. They understood that that would provide some space within which countries could pursue social democratic policies, welfare state policies, without being overwhelmed by market forces that would prevent it. It's the only way to protect that. That was well understood, and that's quite true. Free capital movement creates what's sometimes called a virtual parliament, a parliament of investors and lenders who have veto power over government decisions, sharply restricting democratic options. Actually, I'm quoting from technical papers in the economics literature. Free capital movement creates what's called a dual constituency, namely voters, that's one constituency, and investors and lenders, that's the other constituency. And the investors and lenders conduct moment-by-moment referendums on government policy. If they don't like a policy because it's harming them, they veto it by withdrawing capital from the country or attacking the currency. And of course, the second constituency, the investors and lenders, they prevail. The first constituency can't compete with them, and that's true even in the rich countries. And furthermore, that's well understood. And that's one of the most striking differences between the current phase of globalization and the phase before World War I. Let me just quote from, sorry, it stands a little technical, but this is the standard history of the international financial system by a highly regarded American economist, Barry Eichengreen. He points out that before World War I, government policy had not yet been politicized by universal male suffrage and the rise of trade unions and parliamentary labor parties. Therefore, the very severe costs of market discipline, financial rectitude, they could be imposed, the costs that are imposed by the virtual parliament, they could be transferred to the general population because you didn't have this politicization. Notice that logic is exactly the same as structural adjustment in the poor countries. You impose the costs on the poor and they can't do anything about it. That's the way it was in the West 100 years ago. But that luxury was unavailable under the more democratic Bretton Woods period after the Second World War. There was universal male suffrage and parliamentary labor parties and unions, and furthermore the world population was very radical at that time, been greatly radicalized by the war, and there was enormous popular support, including the United States, for welfare state programs, and therefore it was necessary to do something, and what Eichengreen points out is that limits on capital mobility substituted for limits on democracy as a source of insulation from market pressures, which is quite true. The limits on capital mobility allowed democracy to function. You couldn't and he doesn't follow the argument to the next step, but we easily can. Dismantling of the Bretton Woods Agreement should lead and has led to a sharp attack on substantive democracy, just as you'd expect. Particularly striking in the United States and Britain, which are in the lead on this, but in fact worldwide. Well, this attack on democracy is a very significant feature of the second phase, globalization phase, of the post-war world, and there are other components of the Washington Consensus have the same consequences. The basic idea of neoliberalism is to shift decisions, socioeconomic decisions, to unaccountable concentrations of power. That's an essential feature of the neoliberal reforms. But remember, the powerful state remains to protect the masters. They require it. This extension, the attack on democracy is being negotiated right now, in secret as always, at the GATT negotiations, General Agreement on Trade and Services in Geneva. What is a General Agreement on Trade and Services? Well, what are services? Services are anything that could be within the public arena. So education, health, welfare, water resources, communication, anything like that. That's services. There's no meaningful sense in which they're privatizing these as trade and services. That's just, it's called trade, so you can put it under the trade agreement. If you privatize these government services, you can have a perfectly functioning democracy and it will do nothing, because nothing is left in the public arena. So privatizing services, which is what these negotiations are about, essentially eliminates from the public arena anything that might be, virtually anything that might be subject to popular decision making. That's called trade and services, and naturally you have to negotiate that in secret. To the extent that anything leaks out about it, there's huge public uproar. Actually, the importance of protecting the public from information was revealed very dramatically at the April Summit of the Americas. Every editorial office in the country, in the United States, had on its desk two major publications, which were timed for release at the summit. One was by Human Rights Watch, the main human rights organization in the world. A second was by the Economics Policy Institute, which is a major, economics analysis institute in Washington. Both studies investigated in depth the effects of NAFTA on working people in the three countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Now, NAFTA was presented at the summit as a tremendous triumph. That's what George Bush said, and the headlines read, and it should be a model for the free trade area. And it's very easy to see why. Both studies were totally suppressed, didn't appear anywhere. And it's easy to see why. The Human Rights Watch report presented extensive detail about how labor rights were harmed in all three countries. The Economic Policy Institute report studied in detail how the conditions, wages, working conditions, etc., of working people were harmed in all three countries, demonstrating that this is one of those rare trade agreements which succeeded in harming everybody in all three countries, at least apart from the people who count, they did fine. I don't know how much time I have. Somebody tell me how much time I have. I lost track. Pardon? Keep going? All right, tell me if I'm going on too long, because I lost track. If you look at the effects on Mexico, they're particularly instructive for countries like India, or for any place in the South. And there the effects of NAFTA were particularly severe. In fact, Mexico began the neoliberal reforms about 20 years ago, and wages have declined steadily since that time. That continued after NAFTA, with a 25% decline for salaried workers and a 40% decline for the self-employed. And that's an underestimate because it doesn't take account of the fact that the number of unsalaried workers increased greatly. So the actual effects are even worse than that. This includes the maquiladoras, the foreign-owned manufacturing assembly plants. Foreign investment grew after NAFTA. Big headlines. No headline for the fact that total investment declined. So foreign investment went up, but domestic investment went way down, and the total declined. And the economy was transferred into the hands of foreign multinationals. The minimum wage lost 50% of its purchasing power. Manufacturing declined. Development stagnated, may have reversed. Meanwhile, trade between the U.S. and Mexico did increase. However, the component of trade that is internal to a firm, that is centrally administered by a totalitarian system, that increased from a half to 2/3. Now that's called trade by economists. That's not trade in any meaningful sense. It's not trade if General Motors moves something to Mexico to be assembled and sends it back to the United States to sell. If you discount that, trade actually reduced between Mexico and the United States. These studies actually confirm what had been reported in the business press, and academic studies, I won't go into the details because I guess I am running out of time, but it's essentially the same story, and very familiar around the world. Agriculture suffered a particularly severe blow for the usual reasons. Mexican farmers can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, with effects that are familiar throughout the world. Actually, most of this had been predicted by critics of NAFTA, but they were wrong in one respect, and me too. And me too, anticipated that there would be a sharp increase in the urban-rural ratio after NAFTA, as hundreds of thousands of peasants were driven off the land. Okay, that didn't happen. The urban-rural ratio remained the same. The reason is that conditions deteriorated so badly in the cities that there was a huge flight of people both from countryside and city to the United States. And those who survive the crossing, many do not, work for very low wages, no benefits, under awful conditions. The effect is to destroy lives and communities in Mexico, but that's not counted when you measure effects of things. And it improves the U.S. economy. One study, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, points out that consumption in the United States is subsidized by impoverishment of farm workers, both in the United States and Mexico. So it's a benefit for the economy, for the health of the economy. Well, these are among the costs of NAFTA and neoliberal corporate globalization generally, but those are costs that professional economics chooses not to measure. And it's a choice. You could measure those if you wanted to. They're called externalities. We don't count them. But even by the highly ideological standard measures, which dismiss these costs have been very severe, and from what I've read, I understand the same is true in India. Well, none of this was allowed to disturb the celebration of NAFTA and the free trade agreement at the Summit of the Americas. And in fact, unless people are connected to activist organizations, they cannot know any of this. I mean, they know it in their own lives, or in the lives of the people near them, but they can't know that this is general. In fact, one effect is to make people feel like failures. Here, there's a fairy tale economy out there, but my income is declining, and the people around me work harder, and so on, so there must be something wrong with us. In fact, us happens to be almost everybody, so for about 75% of the workforce, wages have stagnated or declined over the last 25 years, the globalization period, in the richest country in the world, and the only way incomes are kept up is by increasing working hours. Ordinary, median American, middle of the American working class, what are called middle class Americans, work about a month extra a year, family, just to keep wages stagnant. That's the highest workload in the world. Well, that picture generalizes around the world. There's some variation. The main exception are countries which, I'm quoting now, which did not follow the religion that the markets know best. I'm quoting from the latest Nobel Prize laureate in economics, Joseph Stiglitz, in an article he wrote just before he was appointed chief economist of the World Bank, a position which he did not keep very long because he kept making such annoying statements. He was kicked out. But what he said is correct. The countries that didn't follow the religion that markets know best did succeed in growth, extensive growth during the neoliberal period. Almost everywhere else it was pretty much what I've just described. Worse for countries like Mexico than for the United States. Furthermore, this is expected to continue. If you look at the provisions of the World Trade Organization, they deprive countries of exactly the mechanisms that were used for development. all of them are market interference, without exception. There isn't a single rich, developed country that didn't rely crucially on extensive market interference. That holds from England up to the East Asian NICs and the United States dramatically. If the United States had followed the principle of comparative advantage, the rules that the poor must accept under contemporary neoliberalism, the United States would now be exporting fish. It would certainly not be exporting textiles. The only way it could develop textiles was by extremely heavy protectionist barriers that kept superior British textiles out. Actually, the reason Britain was producing textiles is because it did the same thing to India. It imposed heavy duties to keep Indian textiles out, not just textiles, ships, steel, iron manufacture, all sorts of things, because they couldn't compete. Meanwhile, India was compelled to follow liberal rules. It became what's called an ocean of liberalism by economic historians, and the results are obvious. Countries like the United States couldn't have developed a steel industry for the same reason. British steel was superior, just as Indian iron had been superior to British iron a century earlier, and it was changed the same way. And that goes right up to the present. Often a military cover is used for this. The dynamic source of the U.S. economy is under the cover of the military system. It's a massive state sector of the economy. That includes just about everything, the whole new economy, electronics, computers, the internet, in fact, telecommunications. You just go through the list. It's developed under a military cover. And if you look at the World Trade Organization rules, you'll notice that they have a way of dealing with this. You're allowed to what's called a national security exemption. So you're allowed to violate the rules for national security. Okay, for Haiti, that doesn't help a lot. But for the United States, it helps quite a lot because it includes the whole economy. The whole economy can be developed within a national security exemption by placing it under, the cutting edge of it under the military, and that's exactly what's done. You can hear, Alan Greenspan telling about the wonders of the entrepreneurial economy and rugged individualism and so on, and he even gives examples of these things. You take a look at the examples, every single one of them, without exception, was developed in the state sector extensively over a long period. And it's inconceivable that he doesn't know this. I mean, this is common knowledge, but it's, again, not the kind of thing that, not the kind of information that people have the right to. You take a look at economic history, all of this is just dramatically clear. Just ask yourself a simple question: which countries developed? Well, the countries that developed were Europe, North America, Japan, a couple of the countries in the Japanese colonial system, and that's about it. The rest of the world not only didn't develop, but it was pretty much destroyed. There's a characteristic in common to the countries that developed. They maintained their sovereignty. They were not colonized. And the correlation is extremely close. You don't find correlations like that in history. Countries that maintained their own sovereignty and were able to violate the rules and integrate themselves into the economic system on their own terms, many of them did develop. Countries that lacked sovereignty were subjected to external control, without exception, did not develop. Again, it takes a lot of discipline for economists and other intellectuals not to notice this fact. It's quite striking. Under the contemporary versions of, and I should say this completely understates the reality. So take, say, the beginning of industrialization everywhere is textiles. Britain succeeded in developing a textile industry by destroying the superior Indian textile industry and by protectionist devices and state intervention. But textiles were based on cotton, and cotton was cheap. And why was cotton cheap? Well, cotton was cheap because of an institution called slavery. Slavery is a rather severe market interference. But when you study market economies, you don't count that. You don't count the fact that there was a massive market interference, namely by state violence, of the most extreme kind that kept the basic commodity cheap. Cotton was like oil today, and in fact oil is kept cheap the same way. A huge part of the Pentagon budget is directed to maintaining the price of oil within a certain range. The few studies that are around count that as about 30% subsidy of the oil price, and there's plenty of other energy subsidies. Well, those things just aren't counted. But even if you take the things that are counted, the facts are very, very clear. Under the current version of traditional mechanisms, about half the population of the world right now is literally in receivership. That means their economic policies are managed by bureaucrats in Washington. But even in the rich countries, democracy is under attack by virtue of the shift of decision-making from governments, which may be partially responsible to the population, to private tyrannies, which don't have those defects. They're unaccountable, so they're fine. Shift decisions to them, everything's great. And that has very striking effects. So take, say, Latin America. Latin America has undergone a wave of democratization in the past 10 or 15 years. Military dictatorships were replaced by democracies. Academic specialists who follow this closely have been observing for years that as democracies extended in Latin America, disillusionment with democracy is increasing. And that trend continues. Just a recently released study revealed that about half the population of Latin America would now support democracy, and about half would be willing to accept military dictatorships. The military dictatorships in Latin America were extremely brutal affairs. But after the wave of democratization, about half the population wouldn't mind if they came back. And the reasons are very clear. They're reported, in fact, even in the business press. London Financial Times reporting this said that the reason is an alarming trend which links declining economic fortunes with a lack of faith in the institutions of democracy. And the reason is that this much praised new wave of democracy happened to coincide with neoliberal economic programs which undermine democracy. So you get more formal democracy and more disillusionment with democracy. And indeed, Latin America, which has followed the rules most religiously, has been one of the regions that had the worst economic record. It's a correlation that holds worldwide. That also holds for the United States. I'm sure you read a lot about the big clamor about the stolen election of November 2000, Florida votes and the Supreme Court and so on. If you read closely, you'll notice that there was a huge issue in the press and among elite commentators. They were very surprised at the fact that the public didn't care. The public expressed no concern over the fact that the election was stolen. They could never get a rise out of the public with all the publicity. And the reasons are very clear from extensive public opinion studies. They reveal that on the eve of the election, so no Florida shenanigans, on the eve of the election, about 75% of the population regarded the whole process as a farce. It was a game played by rich corporations who do the funding, party leaders who are all crooks, and the public relations industry, which is just crafting candidates to say things that you can't believe even if you can understand them. So who cares what happens? Stolen. What's the difference? It doesn't make any difference anyway. In fact, these same studies reveal there's a measure of what they call helplessness, inability to affect anything that happens. That's been going up very fast. It hit its highest level last November, with about half the population saying that people like us have little or no influence on what government does. That's a very sharp rise right through the neoliberal period. Where there are issues that separate the public from the business world, they simply don't appear on the agenda. So international economic issues. The public has very strong feelings. Business has very strong feelings, but they're opposite feelings. Accordingly, the issue cannot arise in the campaign. The free trade area of the Americas, for example, could not be mentioned in the campaign. And that's true in general of these things called free trade agreements. Actually, the business press more accurately calls them free investment agreements. That's what we ought to call them. The free investment agreements are opposed by the public, supported by the business world and elites generally. Therefore, they cannot appear as issues in campaigns. The constitutional system in the United States was actually designed to have this effect very consciously. James Madison, who's the main framer in the Constitutional Convention, he explained that the goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And he said, therefore, to achieve this, political power must be placed in the hands of the wealth of the nation, men who can be trusted to secure the permanent interests of the country, which are the rights of the property owners, and to defend these interests against what he called the leveling spirit of the general population. Yeah, that continues to the present. It takes various forms, but that same principle is a leading principle of progressive political thought, progressive note, right up to the present. And technical political scientist types who write about these things say that it's wrong to describe the United States as a democracy. It should be described as a polyarchy. That is a system in which elites rule and the public ratifies. The public is supposed to show up every couple of years and say, you make the decisions, and then you go home and buy shoes or something like that. That's the ideal system. And from that point of view, the November 2000 election didn't reveal a flaw of American democracy, but revealed its triumph. And that triumph has been greatly enhanced by the neoliberal programs. Well, throughout all of this, a crucial element is restriction of information. That's why there's a huge public relations industry. They tell you what they're doing. It's like it's not a secret. The founding documents of the PR industry back in the 1920s, this guy I'm quoting as one of the founders of it is a Roosevelt Kennedy liberal, and he had a classic manual in which he said the goal of the industry is to regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments the bodies of its soldiers. And that's necessary. You can't have democracy otherwise. Unless the population is totally regimented, you can't allow democracy, because the population will do what they want, and that won't be securing the permanent interests of the country, namely the rights of the rich, who have to be protected from the majority. This is quite conscious. There's nothing secret about it. It's the standard political science literature supported by major figures, Joseph Schumpeter, Walter Lippmann, and others. Well, the struggle to impose that regime takes many forms. It never ends. It's going to continue as long as there are high concentrations of power with the decision-making, controlling decision-making. And it's only reasonable to expect the masters to exploit any opportunity that they have. At the moment, the fear and anguish in the face of the terrorist attacks. But there's absolutely no reason to accept those rules, and fortunately, plenty of people are not accepting them. There's been a very impressive increase in opposition, taking totally new forms in recent years. It mostly developed in the South. It's been joined by the North recently. The masters of the universe are very scared. They recognize what's happening. The meeting in Qatar, I'm sure you know, is an expression of the fear that the public may become involved. If they could figure out how to meet in a space shuttle, they'd meet there. Just keep the public away because it's too dangerous. Every time the public breaks through, there is panic in the business press, literal panic. They know their control is extremely fragile. It can be destroyed at any time. It's mainly a matter of not accepting the injunction to be passive and acquiescent, and to realize that power actually is in the hands of populations, particularly in the more free and democratic societies where it's impossible to use really massive force and violence to suppress the general population. These popular movements are unprecedented in scale. There's been nothing like them in history, in the range of constituency and in international solidarity. And I think the future, to a very large extent, lies in their hands, and it's very hard to overestimate what's at stake.
Thank you very much for this wonderfully rich and thought-provoking lecture. I did tell you that Noam Chomsky knows a fair amount of economics, and I hope that you're convinced now. And he has put us, me and my colleagues, in the difficult position now of having to either accept what he said and forget a lot of what we've been teaching for years, or having to argue with him, which may be even harder. Don't go away, as Larry King says. There's still a lot of exciting things on the program for the next hour and a half. We will have a long question-answer with Noam Chomsky a little later on. If you wish to ask a question, we'd like to ask you to please give it in writing to facilitate the proceedings. So if you have any question, please put it in writing and bring it here to the front. The last half hour of the question-answer session will be for the press. So we will ask the press to ask questions at that time, and that will be directly, not in writing. But anyone else would like to ask a question, then please do it in writing. Before that, we are going to have now a short summary translation by Bharat Dogra, 10-15 minutes, for those who could not follow the lecture in English. Then we'll have another short song from Ramjas College students, and then other speeches from Arundhati Roy, Siddharth Varadarajan, and others, and then the question-answer session. We apologize for those who could not hear very well from the back. We are unable to increase the volume because there are exams going on around here, but we're going to try to relocate the speakers to improve the sound system. And now I'd like to invite Bharat Dogra to give us a short translation in Hindi. After that, already a question has come. Thank you. Now I'll ask Nikhil Dey to conduct the question-answer session.
There are a huge number of questions, about 50. So they've been classified, perhaps very poorly, into 4 broad categories in a hope that at least the kinds of questions will be answered. The first set of questions, Professor Chomsky, refer to, I'll quote one of the questions, and there are several like that. Do you see the present conflict between the Taliban and the US and its allies can take the shape of clash of civilizations as is expected by Mr. Huntington? And then along with that, I'll just add another 2 sets of questions so that you can answer them perhaps together. The concept of religious fanaticism, what do you see it as evolving further, and fundamentalism of various kinds in the world? How can that be fought, and what can stop it? And is there any chance at all for a change in the unequal concentrations of power? Do you see any kind of change? Then there are 2 other categories of questions which we'll also put forward, but if this set can first be.
If I forget, remind me. The first question was, does the U.S.-Taliban confrontation have something to do with Huntington's thesis of clash of civilizations? Remember the context of Huntington's thesis, the context in which it was put forth. This is after the end of the Cold War. For 50 years, both the United States and the Soviet Union had used the pretext of the Cold War as a justification for any atrocity that they wanted to carry out. So if the Russians wanted to send tanks to East Berlin, that's because of the Cold War. And if the U.S. wanted to invade South Vietnam and wipe out Indochina, that was because of the Cold War. If you look over the history of this period, the pretext had nothing to do with the reasons. The reasons for the atrocities were domestically based in power interests, but the Cold War gave an excuse. You know, whatever atrocity you carried out, you could say it's defense against the other side. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the pretext is gone. The policies remain the same. In fact, the policies continue about as before, slight changes in tactics, but you need a new pretext. And in fact, there's been a search for pretexts for quite a long time. Actually, it starts 20 years ago. When the Reagan administration came in, it was already pretty clear that appeal to the pretext of the Russian threat was not going to work for very long. So they came into office saying that the focus of their foreign policy would be to combat the plague of international terrorism. That was 20 years ago. There's nothing new about this. We have to defend ourselves from Arab, other terrorists. And they proceeded to react to that plague by creating the most extraordinary international terrorist network in the world, which carried out massive terror in Central America, and Southern Africa, and all over the place. In fact, it was so extreme they were even condemned by the World Court and Security Council. With 1989 coming, you needed some new pretexts. So, it was very explicit. Remember, one of the tasks of intellectuals, the solemn tasks, is to prevent people from understanding what's going on. And in order to fulfill that task, you have to ignore the government documentation, for example, which tells you exactly what's going on. And this is a case in point. Just to give you one illustration. Every year, the White House presents to Congress a statement of why we need a huge military budget. Okay. And for every year it was always the same. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming, so we need this monstrous military budget. The question that everyone who is interested in international affairs should have been asking themselves is, what are they going to say in March 1990? That is the first presentation after the Russians clearly aren't coming. They're not around anymore. So that was a very important document, and it's extremely interesting. And of course, it is unmentioned anywhere, because it's much too interesting. Actually, I wrote about it, but I don't know anybody else. It's a public document. You have to work not to see what's in it. And it was quite interesting, as you'd expect. March 1990, the Bush administration, first Bush administration, gave its presentation to Congress. It's exactly the same as every other year. We need a huge military budget. We have to have massive intervention forces, mostly poised at the Middle East. We have to protect what's called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism that means high-tech industry. We have to ensure that the public pays the costs of high-tech industry by funneling it through the military system under the pretext of defense. So it's exactly the same as before. The only thing that was different was the reasons. It turned out the reasons we needed all of this was not because the Russians are coming, but, I'm quoting, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's why we need the huge military budget. The massive military forces aimed at the Middle East still have to be aimed there, and then comes an interesting phrase. It says they have to be aimed at the Middle East where the threat to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. Okay, so sorry, I've been lying to you for 50 years, but now the Kremlin isn't around anymore, so I got to tell you the truth. The threat to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. Remember, it couldn't be laid at Iraq's door either, because at that time Saddam Hussein was a great friend and ally of the United States. He had already carried out his worst atrocities, like gassing Kurds and everything else, but he remained a fine guy. Hadn't disobeyed orders yet, the one crime that matters. So nothing could be laid at Iraq's door, it couldn't be laid at the Kremlin's door. In fact, it had to be laid right at the door where it always had been. the fear that forces within the region would take control of their own destiny, including their own resources, and that can't be tolerated, obviously. So we have to support brutal, oppressive states like Saudi Arabia and others to make sure that they guarantee that the profits from oil, it's not so much the oil as the profits from oil, flow to the people who deserve it, rich Western energy corporations or the U.S. Treasury Department or Bechtel construction and so on. So that's why we need it. Other than that, it's the same. All right, what does this have to do with Huntington? Well, he's a respected intellectual. He can't say this, He can't say, look, it's exactly the same as always before. It's the method by which the rich run the world, and the major confrontation in the world remains what it's always been, small, concentrated sectors of wealth and power versus everybody else. You can't say that. And in fact, if you look at those passages on the clash of civilizations, he says in the future, the conflict will not be on economic grounds. So let's put that out of our minds. Can't think about, rich powers and corporations exploiting people. That can't be the conflict. It's got to be something else. So it'll be the clash of civilizations. The Western civilization and Islam and Confucianism, and that's the clash of civilizations. Well, you can test that. I mean, it's a strange idea, but you can test it. You can test by asking, how has the United States, for the leader of the Western civilization, how has it reacted to Islamic fundamentalists, for example? Well, the answer is it's been their leading supporter. So the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist state in the world at that time was Saudi Arabia. Maybe succeeded by the Taliban, but that's an offshoot of Saudi Arabian Wahhabism. Saudi Arabia has been a client of the United States since its origins. And the reason is because it plays the right role. It ensures that the wealth of the region goes to the right people. Not people in the slums of Cairo, but people in executive suites in New York. And as long as it does that, they can treat women as awfully as they want. They can be the most extreme fundamentalists in existence, and they're just fine. That's the most extreme fundamentalist state in the world. What's the biggest Muslim state in the world? Well, Indonesia. What's the relation between the United States and Indonesia? Well, actually, the United States was hostile to Indonesia until 1965. That's because Indonesia was part of the non-aligned movement. The United States hated Nehru, despised him, in fact, for exactly the same reason. So they despised Indonesia. It was independent. Furthermore, it was a dangerous country because it had one mass-based political party, the PKI, which was a party of the poor, party of peasants, basically. And it was gaining power through the open democratic system, and therefore that had to be stopped. The U.S. tried to stop it in 1958 by supporting a rebellion, generals' rebellion. That failed. They then started supporting the Indonesian army, and in 1965, the army carried out a coup. General Suharto carried out a coup, and they carried out a huge massacre of hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million people, mostly landless peasants, wiped out the only mass-based party. This led to unrestrained euphoria in the West. The United States, Britain, Australia, it was so, it was such a glorious event that they couldn't control themselves. I mean, the headlines were, gleam of light in Asia, hope where there once was none. The Indonesian moderates have carried out a boiling bloodbath. I mean, they didn't conceal what happened. Staggering mass slaughter, the greatest event in history. The CIA compared it to the massacres of Stalin and Hitler, and that was wonderful. And ever since that time, Indonesia was a favored ally of the United States. It continued to have one of the bloodiest records in the late 20th century, mass murder in East Timor, hideous tortures of dissidents, but it was fine. It was the biggest Islamic state in the world, but it was just fine. Suharto was our kind of guy, the way Clinton described him when he visited in the mid-90s. And he stayed a friend of the United States until he made a mistake. He made a mistake by dragging his feet over IMF orders. After the Asian crash, the IMF imposed very harsh orders, and Suharto kind of didn't go along the way he was supposed to. And he also lost control. That's a mistake. He lost control of the society, and at that point, the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, gave him a telephone call and said, literally, and said, "We think it's time for a democratic transition." Merely by accident, 4 hours later, he abdicated and put his, it's one of those strange accidents. But Indonesia remained a U.S. favored state. So there's two of the Islamic states. What about the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist non-state actors? Let's say the Al-Qaeda network. Well, who formed them? No, that's a creation of the CIA, British intelligence, Saudi Arabian funding, Egypt, and so on. They brought the most extreme radical fundamentalists they could find anywhere in North Africa or the Middle East, and trained them, armed them, nurtured them to harass the Russians, not to help the Afghans. These guys were carrying out terrorism from the very beginning. They assassinated President Sadat 20 years ago. But they were the main group supported by the United States. So, where's the clash of civilizations? Let's move a little further. During the 1980s, the United States carried out a major war in Central America. A couple 100,000 people were killed, 4 countries almost destroyed. I mean, it's a vast war. Who was the target of that war? Well, one of the main targets was the Catholic Church. The decade of the 1980s began with the assassination of an archbishop. It ended with the assassination of 6 leading intellectuals, Jesuit intellectuals, including the rector of the main university. They were killed by basically the same people, terrorist forces organized and armed and trained by the United States. In between that period, plenty of church people were killed, and as usual, hundreds of thousands of peasants and poor people on the side. But one of the main targets was the Catholic Church. Why? Well, the Catholic Church had committed a grievous sin in Latin America. For hundreds of years, it had been the church of the rich. That was fine. But in the 1960s, the Latin American bishops undertook what they called a preferential option for the poor. Well, at that point, they became like this mass-based political party in Indonesia, which was a party of the poor and the peasants, and naturally had to be wiped out. So the Catholic Church had to be smashed. Coming back to the beginning, just where is the clash of civilizations? I mean, there's a clash, all right. There's a clash between those who are adopting the preferential option for the poor, no matter what they are. They can be Catholics, they can be communists, they can be anything else. They can be white, black, green, anything. Western terror is totally ecumenical. It's not really racist. It'll kill anybody who takes the wrong stand on the major issues. But if you're an intellectual, you can't say that because it's too obviously true. And you can't let people understand what's obviously true. You have to create deep theories, that you can only understand if you have a PhD from Harvard or something. So we have a clash of civilizations, and we're supposed to worship that. But, it makes absolutely no sense. I got the other question.
Symbolizes many. How many students that you have taught continue to follow or act on your teachings? And in essence, is there some kind of mass hypnosis, or what kind of reaction do you get in the United States to your speeches? So those two.
Well, the second is easier, so let me start with that. I teach graduate courses in linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I've been involved in things like this most of my life. I've been involved in resistance, in and out of jail, all sorts of things. But I don't let it interfere with teaching. So it does not enter into my teaching. If students know about that side of my life, it's because they come to talks or read what I write or something. So there's essentially the influence on students, say, in my own department is whatever it is anywhere else. It has nothing to do with anything that happens in a graduate seminar. That's, you can argue about it, but my view is that's the way it ought to be done. Anyhow, that's what I've done. On the on others, well, the way the United States works, it's a very free country. Very little state repression by comparative standards, especially if you're more or less privileged, as I am. Most of us are. But you can be excluded. So you're excluded from the mainstream, especially the parts that are more to the left liberal side. Those are the real commissars. They have to make sure that you go this far and not 1 millimeter further. That's so they are blocked. On the other hand, there's plenty of opportunities to reach other people. I mean, a few days before I came here, I gave a talk in Boston which had an audience of about 2,000 or 3,000 people, and was over the internet, broadcast live over the internet, and all sorts of things. And that goes on all the time. And it's not just me; it's other people who spend their lives the same way. So there's considerable, very large outreach, and this kind of interacts with. It doesn't create popular movements by any means. In fact, it responds to them. It's the popular movements that create the opportunities for things like this. So all these hundreds of talks I give all over the place are organized by somebody, and they're organized by local people who are carrying out some kind of work, which can be with women or working people or homeless or immigrants or a million other things, and they want an occasion in which somebody will come and give a talk for a fundraiser, or take part in a demonstration, or whatever it may be. And those are the opportunities, and that reaches huge numbers of people. It's because of these activities that the country has just changed radically in the last 30 or 40 years. Completely. It's a totally different country. It's much more civilized than it was 40 years ago. That's why the 60s are so hated. The 60s are so denounced in elite discussion. The reason is they had a very substantial civilizing effect on the society in many different ways. Women's rights, environmental issues, opposition to aggression, concern. It was the first time. All of this is from the 60s. I mean, it was there before, but it really took off after the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. The anti-nuclear movements and so on. In fact, a striking indication of it is that the 1960s are the first time in U.S. history, first time after hundreds of years, that some attention was paid to the fate of the indigenous population. Remember, that country was built on massive ethnic cleansing. I mean, millions of people were exterminated. There were 7 or 8 million people, maybe more. They're not around anymore. They were just exterminated. And it was never an issue, never discussed. Textbooks, if they talked about it, praised it. I mean, when I grew up as a kid, we would play cowboys and Indians, where we're the cowboys, we kill the Indians. That was just normal. The leading diplomatic history of the United States by Thomas Bailey, a liberal historian, in 1969 describes, he says, after the Revolutionary War was over, kicked out the British, the colonists turned to their next task, namely felling trees and Indians and expanding to their natural borders. Okay, so there were trees in the way and there were Indians in the way, and we sort of knocked them all down and expanded to the national borders. That wasn't considered an odd thing to say. This changed in the it is so deep, it's so deeply rooted that some of the things that happen are mind-boggling. I mean, like, for example, when you read about Israeli helicopters being used to assassinate Palestinian political leaders, 2 questions. Where'd the helicopters come from? Israel doesn't produce helicopters. They were sent by Clinton and Bush for that purpose, knowing that that's what they're for. Furthermore, what's the name of the helicopters? Well, they're Apaches. If they're not Apaches, they're Comanches or Blackhawks, or when you send missiles at Afghanistan, they're Tomahawks. In fact, the weapons of war in the United States are named after the victims of genocide. Now, if in Germany these days they name the helicopters of the Luftwaffe Jew and Gypsy, people would think there's something wrong with that culture, you know. But this goes on and nobody notices it. Well, it's not, 30 years ago, nobody would have noticed it. Now, some people notice it. And there's some concern over what happened. That's part of the civilizing effect of the 60s. And it grew out of, this leads into the more important question, out of just mass popular organization of all kinds. The Central America Solidarity movements of the 1980s were something completely new in the history of imperialism for a number of reasons. They were, first of all, they were huge. Secondly, people didn't just protest. They didn't just have demonstrations. They went and lived with the victims. There were people who went and lived in, you know, Salvadoran villages in the hope that, for one thing, maybe they could help them, but and for another reason, because maybe if there's a white face around, it will restrain the state terrorists that their own country was organizing. That's never happened before. I mean, no imperial war that I can remember did a massive number of citizens go to protect the victims of their own country. I mean, that's a level of engagement that is quite new. Also interesting is that it was not coming from the left. Some of it was, but not most of it. In fact, it was mainly rooted in conservative, Christian, mainstream communities, many of them fundamentalists, in fact, Christian fundamentalists. It was very deeply rooted in mainstream U.S. societies, right out of Main Street, Iowa, and it was very courageous and very honorable, and something totally new. Well, that's another reflection of the same developments. And this does not come from nowhere. We all know where it comes from. It comes from people organizing in their own community or their own workplace or whatever group they happen to be involved in, integrating with one another, making bigger organizations, linking up. By now, the linkages are worldwide. The major movements, by far, are in the South, in countries like India and Brazil and others. I mean, those are by far the major movements. There's nothing close to them. They're not noticed much in the West because who cares what those people are doing. But that's the source of the anti-corporate globalization movement and plenty of other things. I mean, I don't have to tell you, you know way more about it than I do because it's happening right here. That's the way things change. Every significant change in history has come about that way, and the next ones will too. And I think the next ones could be closer than we think, because the system of domination is extremely fragile, as I mentioned, and they know it. You know, that's why it's based on such extensive secrecy. You let people know what's going on, it's going to collapse. And that can hold together for a while, but it's a fragile system, and we know just how to change it, you know, by popular organization that doesn't just oppose what's going on, but creates, quote Bakunin, you have to create the facts of the future in the present society. You build up the kinds of institutions that should exist in the future society and let them begin to work and to flourish, whether they're, you know, workers' control in industry or community cooperative villages, you know, women's groups, whatever it may be. Start building them, let them work and function, and they'll be the future. Once concentrated power is so weakened that it can't survive. How you get the changes, you can't predict, but that's the path. It's what's worked in the past. That's why we don't live under feudalism and slavery and all kind of horrors of the past that are mostly gone. And that's the way you go on.
Thank you very much. All these we'll hand over to Professor Chomsky, so that at least you can feel that it's reached him, and some way you'll get an answer sometime. Now, questions from the press, we have really just 10 minutes. So wherever you are, if you can ask them rapidly, and Soumya, take the mic. Or you could stand.
So what do you think will be the impact if India continues with these policies of liberalization and integrating with the global economy?
Could you identify?
Yeah, I am releasing from you and I.
What will be the effect if India continues with accepting neoliberalism and integrating into the global economy on neoliberal terms? Well, I think there's a couple centuries of history that give you an answer to that. There are differences, of course, but in many ways that's what happened since the 18th century. England imposed a very liberal regime on India. Meanwhile, England itself maintained a very powerful state, the most powerful in Europe, a very high protection. It had a labor management system which was quite different from India's. Actually, if you're interested, there's very interesting scholarly work on this just coming out. The Cambridge University series on Indian history and development has just published a book a couple months ago by Prasannan Parthasarathi, personal friends, based on a Harvard dissertation. I forget the title of the book, but it's about weavers in South India in the 18th century. And by the 18th century. I mean, by the early 19th century, the weavers in South India was a total disaster story. The homes of the weavers were bleaching the plains of India and all that. In the 18th century, they're doing quite well. In fact, his investigations show fairly convincingly that they were better off than workers in England. They had higher purchasing power. They had much more control of their work. There was a much, they were mobile, this was ended by British state power. The British came in first through the East India Company, which is basically a state outfit, and then just by force, and they introduced British-style labor management rules. That meant cut back mobility so that workers don't, as was done in England, control mobility so that people can't resist by going somewhere else, impose tight restrictions, break down the market relations which did exist in India, and that smashed the weavers. So within a century you get a disaster which still continues. And if you look at the history, that's the way it's been. I mean, countries that were compelled to adopt real market principles were destroyed. And those who somehow were able to control their own destiny because they resisted colonization and invariably relied quite heavily on state intervention for development, often not in at all pretty ways, they developed. If India decides to go back to what it was in the 18th century, you can kind of predict what will happen. You'll have a sector of, right through the Raj, there was a sector of extreme wealth in India. There was a sector of Indian society that was very wealthy. The Raj was run by Indians, not by British. The British were in the background, but the place was mostly run by Indians. Even the army, until the 1858 Anglo-Indian War, the army was mostly sepoys. They are controlling the Indian population. Furthermore, that's the way it is in every other country too. So there'll be a sector of Indian society that'll do fine. Most of the population will suffer. The general economy will be reliant on outsiders, won't be able to control itself, and somehow probably relive the past. That's what I would suspect. On the other hand, of course, the world isn't the same as it was 200 years ago, so it's not going to be a duplicate, but the patterns are pretty clear. As I mentioned, just think about it. There's not a single society that is rich and developed today that followed liberal principles. Not a single one. Every single one of them radically violated, including England. England did finally turn to free trade in 1846. But at that time, England had already achieved twice the per capita capitalization of any other country. So the playing field looked level, tilted in our direction. By that time, Indian manufacture had been pretty much destroyed. And even after, in the free trade period, England didn't rely on free trade. I think about 40% of English exports went to India. That's a colony. It's not free trade. When England could no longer compete with Germany in manufacturing, it still had the controlled Indian market. This continued until the 1920s. In the 1920s, England was literally no longer able to compete with Japanese manufacturing, so they simply called the whole game off. In 1832, England closed off the whole empire, including India, to Japanese imports. That's part of the background for the Pacific War. The Dutch did the same in what was then the East Indies. The United States did the same in the Philippines. Well, yeah, it's part of the background for the Second World War. I mean, everybody's perfectly happy with free trade as long as we're going to win. You know, if it looks like there's some problem, then you stop it. And that's true right up to the present. I mean, the United States is a perfect example. I mentioned the national security exemptions. The national security exemptions in the WTO are just a way for the United States to have a very dynamic state sector, which is the innovative part of the economy, where the public pays the costs. When Ronald Reagan, nobody was more full of passionate rhetoric about free trade than the Reaganites. They were the most protectionist government in post-war U.S. history. They doubled barriers to imports. Now, they were bitterly denounced by GATT, you know, the predecessor of the WTO, for having led the assault against free trade. But that didn't stop them from spouting the wonders of free trade for somebody else, you know. Same right to the present. I mean, Clinton, full of talk about the wonders of the international economy, but when Florida agribusiness couldn't compete with Mexican tomatoes, he just banned Mexican tomatoes. I mean, it happened to violate NAFTA, but, you know, who cares about that? When U.S. supercomputer makers couldn't compete with Japan because they were making better supercomputers, Clinton banned Japanese supercomputers. Okay? It doesn't matter what the trade rules say. You know, you do, if you're powerful enough, you do what you like. You know? And everyone sort of agrees, you know, because what are they going to do? You know, the historical record is pretty clear on this. And I think you can pretty well predict where it'll lead. In fact, I think you can see it happening in India in recent years. There was another question, but what was the rest? Yeah.
Could you tell us something about the apoliticization nature of the NGOs and different funding agencies which are pouring into hard work?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it exactly.
Depoliticization
Depoliticization coming from the NGOs? Yeah, I understand. Well, I mean, all of you know it's a very double-edged kind of business. I mean, there are many NGOs that do really good things. On the other hand, one of the effects of the NGOs, quite commonly, is to take decisions away from the communities, and also to give the state an excuse not to be concerned with the things it ought to be concerned with, like health and education and so on. These are paths that, if the NGOs are serious, you know, a lot of them are just kind of power agencies of some other state or corporations or whatever. But the ones that are seriously concerned with authentic development and democratization and rights, they have to be very wary of this. They should follow the lead of the communities, not dictate to them. And they should not provide a means for the governing authorities to transfer power to corporations and say, we're not going to care about health and welfare. And there's no simple answer. I mean, they deal with these things in different ways. Some of them, I think, do pretty well. Like, take Oxfam. As far as I'm aware, around the world, it's handled these problems reasonably well. Others, the results are not so good.
Hello, I'm Krishna from Economic. I just want to also there's some change in the political system. You oppose democracy, you oppose communism. So, what kind of political systems we have for all these things?
Well, I think democracy might be a good idea. It kind of reminds me of a statement attributed to Gandhi. I don't know if it was actually he said it or not. He was supposed to have been asked what he thought about Western civilization, and the answer was supposed to be, it might be a good idea. And I think you can say the same about democracy. True functioning democracy, meaning local control of decision making in any structure whatsoever, community, a workplace, a collective, peasant association. I mean, there's all kinds of forms. That should be the basis of a decent, reasonable society, with further integration and federation from the bottom up as is feasible and beneficial, all the way to international organizations. I mean, this is just the traditional anarchist idea. It's not a novel idea. I'm not saying anything new. And it's a kind of the natural direction in which a commitment to democracy ought to lead, I think. There are plenty of barriers to it, but they can be overcome. In fact, just think of the barriers. In the 20th century, there were three forms of totalitarianism that developed: Bolshevism, fascism, and corporations. They really are three forms of totalitarianism. And in fact, they have pretty much the same intellectual roots. They come out of neo-Hegelian ideas about the rights of organic entities over individuals, big attack on classical liberalism. Well, two of those forms of totalitarianism were overthrown. The third one is rampant, but it's no more graven in stone than the other two. In fact, I think it's weaker. It doesn't have the same kind of coercive force behind it. So it can be overthrown too, in favor of democratic control.
Thank you very much. Please don't move yet. As Arundhati said earlier, Arundhati Roy said, we have a lot of work to do. I think that's very true, and I think that has been amplified many times over by Noam Chomsky in his responses. So if you can, please stay on for the march. Noam Chomsky has very kindly agreed to join the beginning of the march. Before that, let me very briefly thank all the speakers and the participants, and we'll have a very brief farewell song before we move. Please don't move yet. Just after the song, we'll get moving. Thank you.